Thank you very much, Mr. Biddle. Welcome. Meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, partners and friends of the German Consulate General New York, liebe Rachel Stern, lieber Uri Scholtes, dear Mr. Biddle, distinguished panel speakers, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests. I am delighted to welcome you to the conference Identity and Migration, Artists and Composers Who Fled Persecution at this wonderful place and venue of the Sheen Center for Thought and Culture in New York. This conference is co-hosted, as Mr. Biddle already mentioned, by these four organizations and is part of a larger project, Art, Identity and Migration, implemented by the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized and Banned Art and funded by the German Federal Foreign Office through its Consulate General in New York. We feel privileged to work together with Fritz Ascher Society on topics such as this one. In supporting the work of partners such as Fritz Ascher, Germany is dedicated to advancing the memory and public knowledge of the lives and struggles of Jewish individuals and families affected by the genocide all across Europe and encouraging discourse on lesser-known aspects of the Holocaust. It is also our aim to resolutely counter Holocaust distortion and denial, the greatest contemporary threat to the legacy of the Holocaust, in our view. Ladies and gentlemen, I met Rachel Stern for the first time in 2019 and was immediately intrigued by her intellectuality, her energy, and her never-tiring dedication with which she built and developed the work of Fritz Ascher on the lives and struggles of persecuted artists living under tyranny. Following the publication and lecture series on immortality, memory, and creativity, the arts of Alicia Locke-Kahana, Ronnie Kahana, and Kitra Kahana, which was published in January 2021 and forms part of the project Trauma, Memory, and Art. This is the second cooperation that I have the privilege to realize together with Rachel Stern and the Fritz Ascher Society. Today's topic, Identity and Migration, investigates the experience of 7 Jewish European artists who were forced to abandon their country of origin or remain in hiding for many years in response to Nazi policies in effect from 1933 and 1945. But it also goes beyond that, beyond keeping the memory of those artists. It is shedding also light on how migrants and facing these horrors and being forced to flee their country of origin, translate and adapt into different and complex layers of identity. Ladies and gentlemen, the 1930s and 40s saw Central European Jews escaping Nazi tyranny before and during the Second World War. With few possibilities for emigration, tens of thousands of homeless Holocaust survivors who migrated westwards to other European territories had to find and create new lives under very dire circumstances sometimes. Many survivors found themselves living in displaced persons camps where they often had to wait for years before they could emigrate into new homes. Therefore, the approach of today's conference is the more important, as in the past few days we have woken up in a different world. With the military attack against Ukraine, the post-war peace order in Europe, as well as the most fundamental rules of international order have been violated before the eyes of the world. There is nothing that could justify this bloodshed. The aim of this war is to destroy the hope in a right to democracy, a right to peace, and a right to a better future without oppression. The invasion of the Ukraine has already pushed 10,000s of people out of their homes and made them flee across borders to escape violence. And at least half of them have crowded onto trains, jammed highways, or walked to get across their country's borders in what officials warn could become the world's next refugee crisis, with as many as 5 million people expected to be displaced as a direct result of the war. This is also why art in identity and migration is a very timely project and a timely topic. I very much look forward to learning from the insights of the distinguished panel present here today and would like to extend my sincere gratitude to our partners, the Fritz Ascher Society, the Sheen Center for Thought and Culture, as well as the World Jewish Committee, for joining us in promoting topics and hosting this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David DiCerto and Consul Yasmin Pamuk. Good afternoon. I'm so very glad to be standing here today at one of the first post-COVID live events in New York. And I thank those who made this event possible. I thank the Consulate General of the Federal Republic of Germany in New York for generously sponsoring this event and the online exhibition we are celebrating today. I thank the World Jewish Congress North America for supporting this event. And last not least, I thank the Sheen Center and their incredible team with David DiCerto and Josef Kimper for co-presenting this event, which we hope is the first of many collaborations. It is painful how relevant today's discussion is with last week's Russian invasion of the Ukraine. Today, the United Nations Refugee Agency said that over the past 4 days, 368,000 people have fled Ukraine to European neighbors, mainly Poland, Hungary, Moldova, Slovakia, and Romania. Many more, mostly women, children, and the elderly, are waiting at the borders. Up to 5 million of Ukraine's 44 million people are estimated to become refugees if Russia's attack of the Ukraine continues. Even before the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, we were in the midst of a global refugee crisis, with an official count of 82.4 million forcibly displaced persons. Second to today were the numbers of people migrating during the first half of the 20th century, with the rise of Nazism and other fascist movements across most of Europe. At the Fritz Ascher Society, we spent the past few months studying artists who were persecuted by the German Nazis and who survived in hiding or by immigration to the US. Were they greeted with open doors? How did they adjust to their new surrounds? Did their art change? And if yes, how? Today, we celebrate the launch of the online exhibition, Identity, Art, and Migration. I see Robin Owen. Thank you and your fabulous team for bringing our vision into reality. The exhibition focuses on 7 artists who took refuge from the German Nazis 1933 to 45, 6 of whom made it to the US sooner or later, and embeds their stories in the larger story of identity and migration, as well as in the story of American historical and contemporary immigration policies. This is also the starting point of today's discussion. I welcome our panelists, Ori Scholtis and Rebecca Erberding from Washington, D.C., Stephen Rasche from the Catholic University in Erbil, Kurdistan region in Iraq, David Stern from New York City, and Caroline Enger from Englewood, New Jersey, who performs music composed by refugees. A panel discussion and Q&A follow their presentations. Please find bios of the participants on the back of the event flyer. Thank you. Ori Scholtis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you everybody else for being here. And my job is to take you through 100 years with 3 kind of jumps. The middle jump will pertain to the period Rachel just mentioned, and the one of the 7 artists I will not discuss is Fritz Ascher himself, whose internal migration because he was not able to get out of Germany but went into hiding right in the heart of the Grunewald, the Nazi brass area of Berlin, so managed to survive the Holocaust there. I will begin, however, in a previous generation by bringing to the screen, if I may, Raphael Sawyer, whose name is probably familiar to you since New York became his home. He was born in Borysko-Glebsk in the Russian Empire in 1899. He had a twin brother, Moses, also became an artist, and by 1912 or so, the family migrated to the United States, to New York, because of the pressure of the late Russian Empire, the Tsarist pogroms, and so on and so forth. And that means he got here at the age of 13, and clearly, well, he became a New Yorker, he became an American. And the image I've chosen, which dates from 1932, it's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, it's an oil-on canvas, is the artist's parents. They would not have been 13. They would not have spent their youths and growing up here. They would already have been fully formed adults. And I think that may well be reflected in the image of them that he has presented to us. So you see a kind of compositional pyramid in which they fit. And you see that they look out of that pyramid, but not to us, but rather through us or beyond us at something altogether different. His father's hand raised up to his forehead as if in some sort of pain. You'll note that the triangle, slightly oblique, has its peak with a small image, black and white, clearly, it would seem, an old image from the old country. So they remain very much embedded within that triangle, and what is outside of it? Well, the present world, you and me whom they're ignoring, and notice how he decided to put that ugly wall switch on the wall. He could obviously have left it out, it's not necessary, but perhaps it functions as a kind of symbol of the current world in which they are so uncomfortable. Of course, all of Sawyer's images tend to have these eyes that are these black dots somehow looking elsewhere, inward, beyond, and one wonders if it reflects an enduring discomfort that he never really got rid of, even by the time he died in 1987 at the age of almost 89. Or is it just Sawyer because Sawyer was Sawyer? Born in the same year, 1899, is Annie Albers, whose image we see before here, not her. And she was born in Berlin. In 1922, she went to the coming to be renowned school, the modernist school known as the Bauhaus. But through several iterations, it reached the point where when Hitler came to power in 1933, it was closed. And she and her husband, she married Joseph Albers, an instructor there, one of her instructors, in fact, back in 1925. They came to the United States, and they went to Black Mountain College, where all sorts of interesting things were going on, where they remained until about 1949 before coming to New York City. Here's the thing about Annie Albers. She was received warmly in the arts community because her husband was already renowned. She says, well, I was just the housewife, but her English was excellent, so she was actually the one whom the interviewers interviewed when they first came over. And by 1949, when they came to New York, she had her first exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, and this is the kind of stuff that was exhibited, wall hangings like this, made of silk, because she transcended the boundary between craft and fine art. In fact, she pioneered the transcending of that kind of boundary. So her place in this country, almost from the get-go, was about as comfortable as it could be. One has relatively little emphasis in the course of her career of her having felt discomfort by way of displacement. Eva Hesse was born in 1936 in Germany, in Hamburg, and at the age of 2 or 3, she and her older sister were quickly sent out of the country, among the last to get onto Kindertransports, and they went to the Netherlands initially and eventually were able to hook up about 6 months later in New York with their family. So she grew up on the Upper West Side in a community that was largely made up of immigrant refugees. And one can imagine, she was here from the age of maybe 3. She grew up as an American at the same time. She could never have not had a strong consciousness of her roots in the other world, the old world, the German language, and not just the English language that she was speaking around things. And she became an artist recognized already in her teens as someone to watch. She also experienced a lot of loss, not just her country, which she may not have remembered, but the divorce between her parents, her father's remarrying, her mother's suicide. She marries another sculptor, Tom Doyle, and they end up getting a fellowship to Germany in 1965, where they were working on their own projects. The marriage wasn't going well. The old factory where they were working cannot have been overly friendly as an environment, but it was there, ironically enough, going back to the country that had spat her family out, that she found the resources to become the pioneer that she became sculpting with latex and fiberglass and plastics and the like, and becoming a champion and a pioneer of post-minimalism, in the 1960s. And so this work, called Hang Up in 1966, of course, puns on the idea of hanging. It's hanging on the wall. It's a painting. It's not a painting. There's nothing in the frame. The frame is tubing wrapped with tape. And of course, pouring out or pulling out from it is this odd wire that contrasts in its irregular curvilinearity with the regular rectilinearity of the frame, and also asks the question, sculpture, relief sculpture, painting, what's going on here? It's just one of a whole range of works, of course, that are part and parcel of the kind of revolution that she was bringing about in the visual arts in New York at that time. So too, Lily Renee, and I should say Eva Hess died in 1970 of a brain tumor. She was only 34 at the time. Lillian Renee, who is originally Lily Renee Wilhelm, also born in 1921 and now in her 101st year, also came by way of kindertransport toward the end of her teens to England, where she served well as a servant, as a nanny, as a candy striper, all sorts of stuff before managing to re-hook up with her family here in New York. And her mother saw an advertisement which Lily answered at one point, and it was for comic book illustration, because of course all the comic book illustrators were men. This was a man's domain, but they were all serving in the war, so they had to bring in women. She was a pioneer in bringing women into that domain. Later on, she did children's books. She had an enormously successful career beginning at Fiction House, and one of her characters, renowned as this one, Señorita Rio, kind of a James Bond, except it's Jane Bond, as you can see, fighting the bad guys. And at one point, she commented how all of these scenarios were sort of her way of fighting the Nazis by way of the art that she was doing. Some of the stories were directly so, and many more of them were indirectly so. So she, too, found her way very clearly and successfully in this world. And you could say even more so, the same about Artur Szyk, who was born in 1894 in Poland, in Łódź, and which was then part of the Russian Empire. And he studied in Paris. When war broke out, he was in London. He managed to come to Canada in 1940 in July, and by the end of the year had managed to come over the border to the United States. His work reflected his Polish sensibilities, his Jewish sensibilities, his American sensibilities, enormously detailed, illuminated manuscript style of working with watercolor and pencils and the like. And he already arrived in this country well recognized as a very successful artist because he was so unique. And once he got here and the war was on, boy, did he put himself in service of fighting against Nazism with his pen mightier than the sword. In fact, Eleanor Roosevelt said of him, he's a one-man army. And in fact, his images were more popular with American GIs than the traditional pinups that they used. So you can see just one example here, Hitler's World, and you can recognize the various characters around the Führer as they spin the globe to figure out what and how and when and whom they can swallow up. Just substitute the Führer's face for Vladimir Putin's face, and you'll understand how contemporary that can be. He died of a heart attack in 1951, relatively young. Friedel Zubas was also born in Berlin in 1915. He lived until 1994. He died in Massachusetts, and he fled Germany directly for the US in 1939. He came to New York, and eventually he was able to find his way into what was becoming, by the end of the war, the new form of American art, abstract expressionism, large, muscular, eventually by the 50s, bifurcating in the gestural or actionist directions and the color field or chromaticist directions, Pollock here and Rothko and Newman there, that sort of thing. Part of the New York school, he shared a studio with Helen Frankenthaler. He was part of the 9th Street Show of 1951. And by the 1960s, he's regarded as kind of a color field painter, but look at the image you have before you, which is so typical of where his work is going by the 70s. This is from 1975. It's called Procession. He's got a number of works with that kind of a title. And you realize two things about him. One, you can tell by looking, and that is he's found a niche, a place between the gesturalists and the chromaticists, large slabs of smooth, sweet, and attractive color, but at the same time, there's an energy that reflects a kind of gestural sensibility. What you can tell from a slide is that the image you're looking at is nearly 10 feet tall and almost 25 feet across. So he's taken the American abstract expressionist largeness, America large, and he's exaggerated it beyond belief. He becomes larger than large as an American artist. This group reflects different senses of finding their ways in different ways, in having to change from where they've come from to coming to the United States. Very different from the same group, however, is Rudi Lesser, born in 1902 in Berlin. He, in the 20s, as a graphic artist and occasional watercolorist, was already being highly praised by big names like Käthe Kollwitz and Georg Rosch as someone with a huge future, and he seemed to be moving in a huge future way. 1933, he's fortunately away from his studio when the SS comes in and completely trashes it. And friends let him know, no, you can't come back. So he leaves, in fact, with his young son, and goes across to Scandinavia and spends the war years actually in Denmark and then in Sweden. So oddly or interestingly, Rudi Lesser came to the United States just after the war, 1946. His mother had gotten here, his younger brother had gotten here before the war, and so he had a place to come. And here, he found a place. He taught for a semester, possibly a year at Howard University in Washington, D.C. He continued to do what his imagery had always done. This is, of course, a self-portrait. His imagery championed the underdog, the worker. When he came to this country, he felt an affinity for African Americans. He immediately joined the NAACP. That may or may not connect to why specifically he was teaching at Howard University, at a historically black university. But the point is, yet he never really felt comfortable here. He stayed in the United States for 10 years. And in 1956, he went back to Berlin. That's where he spent the last 32 years of his life. He died in 1988, living in a modest apartment with his dog, with his chess set. You'd see his back in the same bar through the window every evening, dog at his side, a briefcase with some sausage he'd sometimes give to the dog, the chessboard, often a beautiful, much younger woman also at his side, doing the occasional graphic art, illustrating local newspapers, that sort of stuff. He never found it here, even though one might think he found it here. So there was something intangible about the transformation of location that affected him. So from Sawyer to this group of artists, I take one last jump forward to the late 1980s and 1990s, and the work specifically of Misha or Michael Yofin, let's try that again, who was born in Leningrad, as it was called then, in 1959. He just passed away about 2 years ago, and I'm not sure. I think from COVID, but I have not been able to find out. We were in contact, and suddenly that ended. In San Francisco. He was, in Leningrad, the star of his class in the art school from which he was thrown out because he was considered subversive, because he wasn't doing what the Soviets wanted him to be doing. It was 1991 when he came to the United States, and this is a relatively early painting of that new period, acrylic and tempera on canvas. You can see it's called 4th of July, and he's given us a diptych with the American side on the right and the Russian side or the Soviet side on the left. You can see the two flags in the lower right and lower left. You can see the two different kinds of houses. You can see the perfectly repaired and very imperfectly prepared roofs, and so on and so forth. It is as strong a visual statement as one could hope to have of a bifurcation within his own soul between those two identities. Which brings me to my last artist, about whom and from whom you're going to hear later today, David Stern, born in Essen, Germany in 1956, who eventually came to the United States, to New York, to here, in 1994. This is a work from about 1994, from an exhibition that was done at the museum I used to direct, which was called Identity and Relationship. David's work was figurative, look at it, intensely abstract sensibilities, expressionist with a ferocity, and a thickness that if you could see the canvas up front, you'd say, wow, it's almost like a relief carving. And in fact, if you're close to it, you wouldn't discern these as figures at all. It would just look abstract. You have to step back, step back, step back in order to realize that you've got this couple in embrace. It's as if Van Gogh has climbed onto the back of Soutine, has climbed onto the back of Frank Auerbach, who has climbed onto the back of David Stern, or perhaps I have it backwards. Maybe it's David on Auerbach's back, who is on Soutine's back, who is on Van Gogh's back. He has taken the expressionist idea beyond where it had been heretofore, but it's about people. It's about relationships. That's not the only work that he does, but it's constantly a motif of things that he does. And so he comes to the United States in '94, and the question of how to reorient himself is actually not all that difficult, because people are people, that's his focus. Relationships are relationships, that's his focus. And of course, after 9/11, living in New York with what happened, and his work is in the National September 11th Museum here in New York City, he does a whole series, for example, such as these two, called part of a group called Gatherings in 2002. On the one hand, of course, this is very different from the previous image. On the other hand, it is a redirected version of the previous image, so that he has found his way very clearly and distinctly from one world to the next, from Köln, Germany, where he was living, to New York, where he still lives. When one steps back from all of this, and obviously it's only brief, we see diverse examples of art as an expression of comfort or discomfort, of success or failure, in translating one's identity from one's point of emigration to one's place of immigration. And this is obviously an idea that was not only relevant 100 years ago, and relevant 50 or 60 or 70 years ago, and relevant 25 years ago. Alas, it's more relevant than ever today. Thank you all very much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Belding, and I'm a historian of American responses to the Holocaust, which inevitably means that I write and think a lot about the questions of immigration and how US law and policy in the 1920s and 1930s affected refugees attempting to flee Nazi Europe. It kind of makes a lot of sense for me to follow Ori because he told so many great and personal stories, and my story is about bureaucracy. And so this is kind of a synonym. He is telling stories of unique individuals navigating a world, and I am talking about how those unique individuals were forced into a bureaucratic system. It's really important to point out two differences, immediate differences between then and now. First, there was no such thing as an Einstein visa. Even Einstein did not come on an Einstein visa in the 1930s. He came as a temporary visitor who had to leave the country temporarily to turn from a tourist into a permanent immigrant to the United States. So Einstein did not have an Einstein visa. And second, while the term refugee was used in the 1930s and 40s, and I'll use it today to refer to potential immigrants who are fleeing racial and religious persecution and violence, the United States did not include separate provisions for refugees, migrants, or asylum seekers back then. Only immigrants and non-immigrants existed in US law, and all of them, no matter their unique stories, had to follow the same slow, deliberate, and bureaucratic immigration process. The Immigration Act of 1917 had exempted applicants fleeing religious and racial persecution from the literacy test. And so in the 1920s, when Congress people were discussing revitalizing our immigration policy, they looked back on themselves from a few years earlier and said, well, that's clearly all we wanted to do for refugees. And we are just going to carry that precedent forward. So often people assume that the United States passed new laws in the 1930s to either let more Jews in or keep Jews out. And in reality, we did not need to, because we had a 1924 immigration law that kept Jews out just fine. This piece in the New York Times is April 27th, 1924. It is describing the proposed and soon-to-be new Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which was also called the National Origins Act. This is United States law in place from 1924 to 1965, so the entirety of the Nazi period. This is an op-ed by Senator David Reed, who is a Republican from Pennsylvania, the bill's co-sponsor, and he explained in the piece that, quote, "Until now, we have proceeded upon the theory that the United States was the refuge of the oppressed of all nations. The until now indicates to the reader that this is about to change. These two large maps that are spread out just below the headline demonstrated how immigration is to be restricted from now on. The Johnson-Reed Act passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in 1924. It was signed into law by President Calvin Coolidge. And it placed responsibility for the granting of immigration into the United States with American consular officials abroad, rather than with immigration personnel at the border. So Ellis Island, which had been the gateway for millions of immigrants in the previous few decades, people who had presented very minimal documentation for entry, effectively just became a holding pen for immigrants who did not pass a cursory examination on arrival. Everything else was done back in Europe. There was a set number of visas, 2% of the national origins of American citizens as counted in the 1980 census, which were available for each country. And as you can see here, by tying the quota to the 1890 census, the immigration restrictionists who wrote this bill were effectively trying to nullify the impact of Jewish and Catholic immigrants who had arrived in the millions from Southern and Eastern Europe in the previous few decades. They were not part of the national origin of the United States, and the people who wrote this bill did not want them to become part of the United States moving forward. In 1929, Congress passed an overall cap on immigration to the United States at about 154 million quota immigrants each year. The quotas, as you can see, for Northern and Western Europe were the highest, representing 86% of all available visas. And as the law was based in the pseudoscience of eugenics, which posited that races and ethnicities had immutable and inheritable characteristics that would not change, potential immigrants had to apply for the quota of their country of birth. Their race was considered their country of birth, rather than the country that they were living in. All applicants had to submit extensive paperwork to the consulate in Europe. You can see an incomplete list here. And if that applicant was successful, the consular official would issue a visa. Throughout the 1920s, quotas were usually either filled or near capacity. But in October 1929, the Wall Street crash and ensuing economic depression led to concerns that the new immigrants would take jobs needed by American citizens. So on September 15, 1930, President Herbert Hoover instructed US State Department officials to strictly enforce an old clause of an old immigration law about being likely to become a public charge. And you can see that immigration drops as a result. In 1933, the lowest level of incoming immigration in US history, more immigrants left the United States than came. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. US diplomats there quickly began to send reports detailing Hitler's and the Nazis' abusive and discriminatory treatment of Jews in the spring of 1933, Jews being molested on the streets, kicked out of public schools and businesses, Jewish businesses being boycotted, books being burned. And at the same time, though, over the 1930s, immigration to the United States begins to slowly increase. State Department officials anecdotally report that most of the applicants are German Jews seeking to leave their country. But any immigrant under this public charge clause who was not extraordinarily wealthy and whose assets were able to avoid Nazi seizure, they needed an American financial sponsor. That sponsor also needed to produce extensive paperwork, including multiple years of tax filings, bank statements, insurance statements, and often letters of recommendation from people in their community stating that they would not abandon this immigrant should that immigrant be given a US visa. The applicants who did not have close family in the United States to provide those means of sponsorship often found themselves going to phone books and just finding people with the same last name and writing desperate letters to them, hoping that there would be some distant relation that they could find or someone who was kind enough to give them a visa, or to give them sponsorship so that they could get a visa. In 1938, the Anschluss, the German takeover of Austria, and Kristallnacht brought new urgency, and many German Jews who might have been hesitant before were not hesitant anymore. After the Anschluss, Roosevelt combined the German and Austrian quota, bringing the new German quota to 27,370 visas per year for anybody born in Germany or Austria. But the demand for visas under the German quota had skyrocketed. By July 1st, 1939, which was the beginning of quota year 1940, more than 300,000 people born in Germany, the majority of them Jewish, were on the waiting list for a US visa. Between June 1938 and July 1940, the State Department issued almost every visa legally available to people born in Germany, leaving just 15 unused. But American popular opinion was still opposed to accepting more arrivals. 94% of Americans polled right after Kristallnacht sympathized with the plight of German Jews, but when they were asked, should we allow a larger number of Jewish exiles to come to the United States to live, 72% of them said no. And the United States was also concerned that Germany was taking advantage of the refugee crisis to send spies abroad. They feared that Americans feared that the countries of Western Europe fell so quickly in the spring of 1940 because of internal subversion, a so-called fifth column that was secretly acting against the state, and that might be happening here too. Travel also became a problem. The majority of European immigrants arrived to the United States by ship, coming here into New York. And due to submarine warfare in the Atlantic and the need to refit passenger ships into troop ships because of war, many passenger lines stopped or reduced crossing the ocean. By September 1940, Lisbon was the only neutral port in continental Europe with ships still sailing semi-regularly to the United States. So if you were anywhere in Central Europe, by the spring of 1940, you had to get to Portugal, crossing all of these borders of countries that were at war to do so. By September 1941, the State Department began to enforce a relatives rule. They denied visas to anyone with close family still in Axis-occupied territory. All applications for immigrant and non-immigrant visas were placed before an interdepartmental visa review committee in Washington, D.C., which added months to an already very difficult process. At the same time, Germany demanded the closure of all American consulates in Axis territory. So the only hope for refugees still in those areas was to escape to a country where American officials were still there, where they could still issue visas. But even that hope was very short-lived. By October 1941, Germany rendered Jewish immigration illegal from its territory. Pearl Harbor brought the United States into war in December 1941, and the next day, Helmno, the first stationary killing center built to murder Jews, opened. By spring 1945, 6 million European Jews had been murdered. Although the Holocaust did begin a very long reckoning related to refugees and displaced persons, laws to assist them over the next 35 years still numerically limited entry for specific populations, with all of those decisions tied up in the Cold War. Hand-wringing over America's failure to open immigration to Jewish refugees in the 1930s has still not resulted in a unified bipartisan long-term U.S. immigration and government commitment to aid refugees. The 1980 Refugee Resettlement Act, which is still in force now in 2022, ultimately places the number of refugees admitted to the United States in the hands of the president and subject to his often domestically focused political whims. So for those who are fleeing violence, for refugees today, people who are even fleeing ongoing genocide, the United States can still look very much like it did in the 1930s, with the door cracked open just enough to garner hope and slammed often enough to despair. Thanks.
I would just jump in quickly. We had placed flyers with the biographies of our speakers, but I feel we have such distinguished speakers that I just want to tell you about their biographies. So we heard about from Ori Scholtes, who teaches at Georgetown University across the disciplines of theology, art history, philosophy, and politics. He's the former director and curator of the Kluznik National Jewish Museum, where he curated about 80 exhibitions. He's the author of several hundred articles and catalog essays, and the author or editor of 25 books, including The Ashen Rainbow, The Holocaust and the Arts, Symbols of Faith, How Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Art Draw from the Same Source, and Tradition and Transformation, 3 Millennia of Jewish Art and Architecture. The second edition is forthcoming. And he's also my co-curator for the exhibition which launch we are celebrating today. And we just heard from Rebecca Belding, who is the author of Rescue Board, The Untold Story of America's Efforts to Save the Jews of Europe, which won the National Jewish Book Award for Excellence in Writing based on archival research. She holds a PhD in American history from George Mason University and has been a historian, curator, and archivist at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum since 2003. She served as the lead historian on the museum's special exhibition, Americans and the Holocaust. And we're now greeting Stephen Ascher, who's a recognized international expert in the field of persecution of religious minorities. During the ISIS war in Iraq and its aftermath, he served with the Chaldean Catholic Archdiocese of Erbil, Iraq, where he managed humanitarian and resettlement programs for displaced Christians and Yazidis forced from their homes by the ISIS genocide. He regularly works on projects involving the preservation and restoration of cultural heritage and has served as official representative to the Vatican Dicastery of Refugees and Migrants. He's the author of the critically acclaimed book, The Disappearing People, The Tragic Fate of Christians in the Middle East. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Rachel, for that introduction. I'd just like to follow real quickly on two items that were mentioned here both by Rachel and then by Rebecca. There are over 80 million forcibly displaced people in the world today, and that's as of before this recent situation in Ukraine. It's easy to forget that in this current day and age where we worry about so many things which are distressing to our own personal comforts here in the U.S. But think of that. As you go home tonight, there are over 80 million people in the world that are forcibly displaced. Right now, it's the largest number in the history of mankind. The second thing I would just mention as well, Rebecca talked about how the immigration laws, especially as they apply to refugees, haven't changed appreciably in this country since the 1930s and the 1940s when we failed to live up to our responsibility to bring in these people that were being faced with slaughter. Nothing really changed in that situation in the last years, and a perfect example of that is the situation of the Christian and Yazidi minorities in Iraq and in Syria during the course of the ISIS war and its aftermath. That situation continued to exist. There were precious few Christians or Yazidis that ever made it to this country. Much of that is the result of this continuing inability for our country to develop a sane and thoughtful immigration policies that can adapt to these situations around the world. And it was specifically and especially egregious in the situation of the Christians and Yazidis in Iraq, in that their persecution, their threatened status, was almost entirely the ultimate result of policies that were put in place by this country over several decades. So just before we get into my talk, I thought it important just to touch on those two items. Again, my name is Stephen Rasha. I'd like to thank the Ascher Society and all the sponsors here for having this really important event. I believe that this could be the beginning of a very important discussion, and I'll get into that a little bit more as I speak, but I'm very grateful to be here today. I'm a lawyer by profession, but since 2014, I've been a lay worker of different stripes within the Catholic Church, working primarily in northern Iraq in support of the Christian community there, which was violently displaced by ISIS in 2014. And during that time, as Rachel mentioned, I served on the Vatican Dicastery for Refugees and Migrants. So this topic of migration and identity is one that I've been deeply engaged with over these past years. Now, my talk today is going to center around two photographs of paintings which can loosely be classified as religious icons. I took both of these pictures in the course of my work in Iraq, and the first of these that we're looking at right now is a photograph of the icon of Santa Barbara, or Saint Barbara, as we know her here in the U.S. I'll give a very quick background on Saint Barbara for those of you who don't know. Saint Barbara first appears in about the 7th century, 7th, 8th century. By the 900s, she is being regularly venerated as a saint. The historicity of her life is in question. Much of it is unable to confirm. But the story that's come down is that she was martyred in the 3rd century somewhere in the Middle East, possibly Lebanon, possibly Turkey. Her story is that she was the son of a wealthy pagan father. She converted to Christianity. Her father did not support that. He tortured her to get her to renounce her faith. She refused to do so, and eventually, in a fit of rage, he cut off her head, which is the picture that you see here. It's difficult to see in this painting. It's somewhat destroyed, and I'll explain that in just a bit. But in a fit of rage, he cut off her head, and shortly thereafter, he was hit by a bolt of lightning and engulfed in a ball of flame. That's the story of St. Barbara. But over the years, St. Barbara has become the patron saint for all sorts of causes within the Catholic and Orthodox world. And in Iraq, in particular, as in much of the Middle East, St. Barbara, Santa Barbara, is deeply venerated. What you're looking at here, this picture that you see here, is of an icon. If we stay with the picture we were just with, if we can go back to the picture, there we go. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. If we can stay with this picture, what you're seeing here, this is a icon of St. Barbara that was taken from the shrine of St. Barbara, which was in the town of Karamdes, just outside of Mosul. This is one of the towns that was overrun by ISIS. The church was destroyed and burned. The shrine was destroyed and burned. And the people all fled and were forced to live for nearly 3 years in a displaced situation in the Kurdish city of Erbil, about 70 miles away. The town of Karamdes, there was fighting there on and off, and at one point, when ISIS had been pushed out of the town, the priests were able to get in really quickly, and they recovered this icon and brought it back to their displaced community that was holding together there in Erbil. They were not able to get back to their town yet, but they were still staying together in this displaced community in Erbil. And the picture that you see there is on the feast day of St. Barbara, and the icon is being displayed. The priest you see on the left is their priest from their town, and the two men in the red stoles are deacons from their church. And so they're holding a feast day celebration for St. Barbara. That is their icon of St. Barbara that they've all grown up with and venerated and had as part of their life since the time that they were born. And now it's become a symbol of unity and strength and hope and identity for them in their displaced situation. Where that painting is right now, it's since been restored. It is back in its original shrine, which has been restored and has been a central place and a central piece of the return to the citizens of Karamdes back to their historical town as they start to rebuild. One interesting thing of note regarding St. Barbara, what is claimed to be her relics in the 12th century were brought to St. Michael's Golden Domed Monastery in Kiev, and that's where they remain today. We go now to the second photo. So this second photo, is the painting that you see up there is a painting of Mar Adai, or we know as the Apostle Thaddeus, also known to us as St. Jude, the Apostle. This painting was taken from the church in the same town, in Karamdes, that was destroyed. This painting hung high up within the church, and you see all the holes and the marks in it. That's where ISIS fighters shot it up. And when the church was reclaimed and the people came back, they took this painting, and it's hanging right there in a community hall at an early gathering of the people after they returned to their homes, or began the return to their homes after ISIS. This painting has not been restored. It's shown there in its state after it was picked up after ISIS. And there's debate now amongst the Iraqi Christians there as to whether or not they in fact want to restore it any further than that. And it's a discussion about whether or not this art and the damage that it's received has now become part of what the art is itself. Both of these pieces were done by anonymous artists. They're probably several hundred years old. The records are not clear on them. Again, the one of them has been restored. The other one, there's a real discussion. Should we just leave it this way? And that would be an interesting thing. I would like to hear from some of the artists here as to whether or not art that has been destroyed or damaged as part of a significant historical event, whether or not those are works that should be restored, or whether or not the historic event that occurred as part of it becomes part of the art itself. So looking at the two of these, as we look at these paintings, what did they mean for the people? Well, they were a sense of unity. They were a sense of identity for these people in their displaced status. These are just two examples. It could have pulled out dozens of them for the Iraqi Christians in their time of displacement. And so in terms of a theme for today to highlight, I would like to highlight their role as unifiers of identity, of hope, for a displaced community. In both cases, these paintings perform not only the role of sacred art, historically bringing the communities together in worship, but also now as a part of their identity, which has sustained them, given them unity and hope in a time of real tribulation. In Catholic teaching, these forces of division, these forces of scattering, are what we recognize as evil, as the evil that exists, as the darkness that exists in this world. Conversely, we view forces of unity, things that are unifiers and bringing together, as representing the forces of good, of the holy that is in this world, of the goodness that is inside us as human beings. As we look at the art, then, of the persecuted, of the displaced, of the migrant, of the refugee, and I was thinking of this as preparing for this talk, it seemed to me, and especially in looking at the artists that are in the exhibits and their stories that are coming up through the exhibit, that all of them carry within them that thread of a commonality of experience in suffering, in dislocation, and being removed, and being scattered. And it seems to me that, especially if we look for it, there still is a sense of unity, of solidarity, that we can find in this artwork that comes out of this scattering, of this dislocation, especially this dislocation and this scattering that's so prevalent in the world today. And understanding that this gathering today is really the initiation of what I hope will be a long dialogue, and hopefully a fruitful dialogue, an interfaith dialogue, a dialogue between the secular and the religious, but about the solidarity of experience that possibly exists out there amidst all of this dislocation. It seems to me that when you look at this art, whether it's the religious art, whether it's secular art, whether it's coming from displaced Jews or displaced Catholics or displaced Yazidis or wherever they may be, this art is all at its root saying one thing. It says, here we are. This is our experience. This is what our experience has made of us. And I would hope that in this important discussion that can come out of this effort by the Ascher Society, I would hope that there's a way for us to continue to look at that, because I do think that in this discussion there is a deep human solidarity that is there at the core of it, a deep human solidarity that's a unifying factor for us and not a scattering factor. So thank you very much for having me here today. I'm very pleased to be part of this effort. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I now introduce David Stern, who's a German-born American figurative painter whose work is rooted in the European figurative tradition and informed by American abstract expressionism. His artistic career spans 40 years, and the main theme and motive of his work has been and continues to be the human condition. He has widely exhibited in Europe and the US and is presented in public and private collections in the United States, Europe, and Asia, among them the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the National 9/11 Memorial Museum in New York, the National Museum in Poznan, Poland, and the state art collections in Dresden, Germany. Welcome, David Stern.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I think I'm here to give a little bit of personal color to the idea or to the fact of immigration. And my personal story, which I'm going to tell a little bit about, is completely undramatic. It didn't happen in wartime, it happened in peacetime, it happened through globalization. So as a young painter in Western Germany, where I grew up under the influence of American soft power, I was fascinated by American abstract expressionism without really understanding it. As I was about to find out when I walked the streets, de Kooning and Franz Klein walked 50 years earlier myself. The way I looked at it was through the lens of formalism. Excavation, as you see here, by de Kooning, for example, was to me like a manifest renouncement of figuration, when, as I understand it now, it was an excavation of his creative powers freed by the rigid categories of European high culture. De Kooning, steeped in the separation of high and applied art and various academic and non-academic schools of painting, had found a way to freedom out of categorical constrictions, culminating in his women's series of the early 1950s, and of course leading to his very own way of figurative abstraction. It took de Kooning almost 30 years to excavate his powers and successfully fuse his European perspective and training with the dynamics he experienced on these shores. The images which follow now are works I created between 2018 and 2021, and they are part of an ongoing series. So about 4 years ago, I shifted my practice from using oil paints and heavy impasto to acrylics as a medium. And I started working on a series I called At the Gates, which in the broadest sense deals with the phenomena of the unknown. That what lies beyond the threshold, the border of the closed door, the gate to a new arena, a gate quite literally for me through the use of different materials and the unknown effects it might have on my work. Working on this series coincided with my renewed interest in cognitive science, rereading the works of Carl Gustav Jung, Elias Canetti, and others. And it has a lot to do with my personal history of being an immigrant and the ambiguity of two prevalent feelings I experienced during the process of my immigration 29 years ago. There's a fear of the unknown in me, maybe to a certain extent in all of us, and then there is the excitement of moving from one state or quality to another, not knowing whether it will be an up or downward move. This series is a reflection on living on both sides of the fence. It also addresses the challenge to one's personal identity through acquiring a predominant status, that of an immigrant, which overlays and obscures individuality. I can't say that I was completely conscious of how much this series was informed by my own personal experience when I started working on it, but in the process, I became slowly aware that the excitement I felt had to do with having been the stranger facing the unknown myself. Each morning is a threshold to the unknown day that lies in front of us. Yet anticipation, mostly based on our past experiences, our solidly wired egos, and our routine, helps to overcome the fear. At the same time, it blinds us and does not fully allow us to experience and see what lays beyond the threshold, even when we already crossed it. As a figurative painter, looking for the king's way to fuse figuration with abstraction in my very own way, my interest is centered on the human condition. The incomprehensible dichotomy of mind and body in the Cartesian sense, and the acting of the individual in a reality which it cannot reliably cognize and understand. A painting can only be relevant to another human being if a painting transcends the physical, metaphysical, or emotional experience of its creator. That is what gives a painting meaning, based on our shared human condition. That is what makes it possible that the earliest paintings known to mankind, the cave paintings at Lascaux, painted roughly 18,000 years ago, are meaningful to us now. They are establishing a far-reaching connection between the lives of the early human hunters and gatherers and us in the 21st century, a bridge over time transcending the experience of early humans. To me, painting is in a sense my own personal attempt to understand the world through the phenomenological gaze at myself and the world. I came to this country in the early years of the Clinton administration. Globalization was the buzzword. Borders were to disappear and cultures were supposed to melt into some global equality. I had reasonable language skills. Excuse me for a second. I had reasonable language skills, some knowledge about US culture and economics, gathered through art, movies, literature, and the reading of American papers. This was before the rise of the internet, and I thought I was prepared for the move. I was 38 years old at the time. As it turned out, I had just a low-resolution picture of the country and the people. I knew only the outlines of its history and little about the ideas which permeate through the system. So I was easily overwhelmed by the energy of my newly adopted city, the enormity of its buildings, the vastness of the country, and the otherness of the place, and the fluidity, the dynamics of American society. I remember being stunned when I realized that there were buildings in New York City erected in the 1940s. There were no gaps in the fabric of the city due to aerial bombing, because the war theaters of the 20th century had been elsewhere. The two archetypical narratives, the homeboy leaves the village and a stranger comes to town, identify the immigrant with both, the one who leaves and the stranger who arrives. This is a substantial change of status. Even if one gives up their home voluntarily, domicile, the destruction or loss of one's home, is a serious and traumatic event. Losing agency, the ability to act and acquire a position in a cultural and social hierarchy one understands and is understood in. The immigrant is forced to start over, learning about the new arena and integrating into the new hierarchy. It goes without saying that this process of integration is fraught with fallibility. Professional qualifications are not accepted, language barriers ensure for subtleties to be lost in translation. Bureaucracy, culture, nature, societal organization, all are different, foreign to the immigrant. All of this is true even in the case of immigration from a country with a similar cultural background as the destination. Obviously, immigration from a different system and culture is far more difficult and demands even more sacrifices from the immigrant. I can barely imagine the magnitude of the culture shock earlier immigrants experienced in times when nation states were still defined by their indigenous population, almost tribal, as the nations of Europe had been at least until 1945. They had only minimal information about the country they were about to enter, and without any recourse, they had to make it work. Not only had they to deal with their own perceptual mistakes, but with a certain amount of hostility with which they were greeted by the early arrivals into America's bona fide immigrant society. One of the strangest things, and I think I always spoke about that, that an immigrant takes his former home, the old country, with him in the form of what is now his cultural baggage, like language, socialization, and belief systems, only to find them very much in the way for a successful adaptation to his new home. But it is impossible to shake them off, and lots of immigrants will never lose their association with their past as a part of a different culture and socialization. They might even solidify them by staying in close contact with other immigrants from the same background and factually make it impossible for them to really arrive. The best an immigrant can hope for is to form his old and new identity into a distinctive amalgam which lets him successfully operate in the new surroundings and contribute insights from his unique perspective to that new arena in society. Coming back to my example of Willem de Kooning, I would argue that the reason the former sign painter who dabbled in inconsequential surrealist images in the 1930s became an international leading artist and icon 30 years later was his ability to adapt to the dynamics of this country and aptly express them in his works. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we hear music performed by Caroline Enger, who is an internationally acclaimed pianist, well known for her deeply felt interpretation of music, ranging from the 18th century to contemporary works. Being a Steinway artist, she has performed in venues like the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, Wild Recital Hall at Carnegie Hall, the National Gallery of Art in DC, the Cathedral Church of St. John the Divine, the Bach Festival in Germany, the National Gallery in Norway, and the White Stork Synagogue in Wrocław, Poland. Thank you, Caroline.
Will I be heard if I speak from the stage then here? Okay, thank you. Okay, thanks. So I have some short remarks about the composers to tie in with today's program. And I'll start off by saying a brief few words about each piece. With the Schoenberg set, I would say that musically he was exploring new compositional techniques. They're very short and use some of his, I think, working towards his curiosity about atonality. As a musician and composer, Schoenberg considered himself to be an Austrian or German and always remained within the German musical tradition. Schoenberg created new methods of musical composition involving atonality, serialism, and the 12-tone row. In 1898, Schoenberg converted to Christianity in the Lutheran Church. This was partly to strengthen his attachment to Western European cultural traditions and partly as a means of self-defense, quote, in a time of resurgent anti-Semitism. Schoenberg continued in his post until the Nazis came to power in 1933. During that same year, while on vacation in France, he was warned that returning to Germany would be dangerous. After long meditation, he returned to Judaism because he had realized that his, quote, racial and religious heritage was inescapable, and to take up an unmistakable position on the side opposing Nazism. He formally reclaimed his membership in the Jewish religion at a Paris synagogue and then traveled with his family to the United States. This happened, however, only after his attempts to move to Britain came to nothing. He would self-identify as a Jew later in life. Schoenberg was a painter of considerable ability whose works were considered good enough to exhibit alongside those of Franz Marc and Wassily Kandinsky as fellow members of the expressionist group Der Blaue Reiter. The next composer that, whose music I performed, Emhoy Segwe Mariam Gebru. The piece that I'll be performing is called Homesickness, and I would say that it really feels like a lullaby. It's nostalgic and comforting. Gebru was born as Yuwubdar Gebru in Addis Ababa in 1923 to a wealthy family. At the age of 6, she was sent to a boarding school in Switzerland where she studied violin. In 1933, she returned to Ethiopia. During the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, she and her family were prisoners of war and were sent by the Italians to prison camps in Italy. Her musical talent did not escape the attention of her family or of Emperor Haile Selassie, who went so far as to personally veto an opportunity for Gebru to study abroad in England, which caused her to sink into a deep depression before fleeing to a monastery. In 1936, the country was invaded by Mussolini, and Ethiopia's leading families either left or were expelled. 3 of her brothers were executed. At the age of 19, she fled to a monastery in Ethiopia, and at the age of 21, she became a nun. She was given a religious name, Segwe Mariam, and ordained as a nun with the title of Emhoy, which means female monk. In 1974, the Ethiopian Revolution began. Emhoy and her family were persecuted as much for their religion as for their social standing. In 1984, after her mother's death, Emma Hoy fled the communists and went to the Ethiopian monastery in Jerusalem, where she still resides. She's now 97 years old. In 2019, an ad campaign entitled Coming Home for Amazon's Echo smart speaker features this piece, Homesickness. So it sort of ties in a broad way with what we're talking about. Her music is also featured in the recent movie, The Passing. I don't know if you've seen that. So now to Paul Ben Chaim, this canzonetta that I perform is a piece from a larger set of 5 pieces. Canzonetta is, in Italian, a small song. And again, with this, I describe it as nostalgic, feeling for home, but using new harmonies that I think he picked up on after being exposed to the music of the, at the end I'll say, the Levant, okay? So Arab sounds, I guess. Before immigrating to Palestine in 1933, Paul Ben Chaim was Paul Frankenberger, the son of a Munich lawyer. He received his professional training as a pianist, conductor, and composer at the Munich Academy of Music. In June 1931, the newly appointed opera manager and advocate of the Nazi Party discontinued Ben Chaim's contract, allegedly for economic reasons. Left unemployed, Ben Chaim viewed his situation as a temporary crisis. A year and a half after losing his position at the Augsburg Opera, he decided to emigrate. In May 1933, he went to Palestine for a 2-month exploratory tour, entering the country with a tourist certificate which did not allow him to make himself known through public performances. The violinist and concert manager, Moshe Hopenko, convinced him to change his last name from Frankenberger to Ben Chaim in order to be inconspicuous. He soon arrived at the bitter realization that, quote, despite my success and status in Germany, in this country I was in every respect an absolute non-entity, standing at the beginning of an unknown, mist-shrouded path at the age of 35. During the next 2 months, he proved himself to be a fine recital accompanist and was assured of a teaching position. He felt encouraged when he realized that communicating in German with the local musicians presented no difficulty. He was utterly disenchanted with the low standard of the Palestine Opera, by the absence of a professional symphony orchestra, and by the, quote, fierce competition for piano pupils. Still, the situation in Germany tilted the balance in favor of immigration, although, quote, this would not be easy. Everyone has close links with the country in which he grew up. He tried to soften his trauma by making plans to use Palestine as an outpost for peaceful creative work, earning a modest living as an accompanist and theory teacher, looking forward to, quote, annual 2-month visits to Europe. If I don't, living here will be unbearable. Quote, furthermore, my decision to transplant myself here does not commit me for the rest of my life. After a short return to Munich to settle his affairs, Ben Chaim immigrated to Palestine in October 1933, securing a visa on the basis of his owning a capital of £1,000, which represented all his savings from his work as an opera conductor in Augsburg. Some immigrant composers in Palestine overcame the trauma of resettlement, and some never completed the process of assimilation. Erich Walter Sternberg and Hans Schlesinger never overcame the difficulties of Hebrew and kept communicating only in German and English. Others had to reorder their priorities, as, for instance, when Bošković and Ben Chaim minimized their activity as conductors and concentrated on composition and teaching. Yet, against all odds, they followed Ben Chaim's firm decision, quote, look ahead, not back. Thank you. Oh, no, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's hard to speak after this touching performance. I would like to open the event right away for questions from the audience, because I'm aware that we're running a little bit late. Please raise your arm if you want to say something. I think there's a mic down there. Do we have a mic down? I was told we have a mic. Or maybe you just stand up and... Okay. Okay. Maybe you can come up to the mic or just stand up and talk real loud. We'll be able to hear you. No questions? Yeah? Yes, please.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, would you please...
I'll repeat it if you didn't hear.
Yeah, I did.
So you talked about the influence on you of people like de Kooning, and
Yeah.
she specifically asked artists who themselves were migrants who might have had an influence on you.
Not necessarily. When I grew up in Western Germany, which was really, as I said also in the talk, under the strict, very prevalent influence of American soft power. So meaning like we were dressing like Americans, we are watching American movies, we were looking at American art, and it was completely overwhelming. And so to me, I looked at America for some, for inspiration, so to speak. But also I had the whole entire canon of European art history and on my back. So that was, America was, like pointing towards freedom, towards something else. So, but I have not particularly any influences on me in terms of that I'm looking at immigrant artists and, that influences me in any way. So,
I have a question for you, because that middle piece sounded so American to me. And I'm wondering, she's from Ethiopia, what kind of influences are you aware of on her? It felt almost like a lyrical fairy girl fae or something of that ilk.
Is this on? Yes? Okay, great, good. So I have no idea why and how that would come about, because actually when I first started, I don't know of any American influences at all. And I think that it's, she was certainly trained, at high levels, and yet her pieces, and I don't mean this in any kind of a judgmental way, but you know how we go to, let's say, I would say that there's a primitiveness to this, and in a sense, in a high art kind of sensibility, because I imagine that she can play the piano up and down, and after all, she was well trained in Switzerland. So I really feel that this is a writing down of improvisations, and so that then is a much more personal kind of expression and a much more direct, rather than using compositional techniques and styles and structure. We got one little change in harmony throughout the whole piece, okay? And yet, I don't know, maybe we could spend another 15 minutes sort of just listening to her noodling around, in a sense, in that same harmonic, basically, kind of a five-note range. But there's an intimacy to it. So I don't know of any particular influences. I think that this is really coming straight from her heart in a way that, of course, every artist and composer is coming straight from their heart, but this is with a little less structure, I think.
Interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, please.
First of all, I have to say that I'm lucky enough to be married to one thing to all of you. It's no question that American policy on immigration is discriminatory. That was the whole point of it. I think by now we will look back, we can understand that. But I had this conversation actually with the Austrian Deputy Consul General here. There are points where you might say, well, look, these people who are going to be coming in, we have to protect them. But in fact, there might be some very detrimental aspects to their immigration to whatever country it's going to be, not only to America. And how do we parse that with the responsibility you have for those people who you're representing, whatever country it's going to be, whatever area it is? There's the individual, of course, is probably very important. That family, that individual is not here to do anything to anyone. But as a group, there are certainly major changes that come from immigration. So sometimes it's not only about discrimination, which I think our policies really are, but they are. But there are some practical realities to letting other types of cultures enter the country, not because it's a different culture, but that culture doesn't necessarily want to be part of the American culture or the East or the Western European culture.
I think I would ask what American culture is, if not an amalgamation of all of the immigrants who have come. And so for that, it's very fluid. And if more people come from a different culture, then American culture changes, and I would argue potentially for the better. So I agree with you that most of our policies in the past have been discriminatory, and there's always been this tension between American humanitarian ideals, the things we say about ourselves as a nation, and the political realities of putting that into practice. And it's a real national conversation that we need to have, and one that neither political party seems willing to have in any sort of open and honest and real way. And that's the conversation that we need to have as a nation, is what is the best way to fulfill those humanitarian ideals, or should we stop pretending that we have them?
I think somehow, you know, when you look at immigration, you need to look at both sides. I mean, the immigrant, as I also said in my talk, I mean, he has been asked to do something. So, and I think that question is kind of also referring to that. You are entering a new arena, so you have to learn the laws of the new arena, and not just the laws. I mean, the whole, you know, when you ask what is American culture, yes, it is of course an immigrant culture, and it has of course evolved and changed, but somehow there is something at the core which you need to be, you know, able to accept if you come here. Which is the same true for any other country. At the same time, I think that there's a huge difference between those who leave like voluntarily, like I did, and those who have to leave because their home has been destroyed. So, and maybe, you know, there needs to be a reaction towards that. So, you know, you look at them maybe more favorable, or you look at them to be in a preferred position maybe. So, but yeah.
And I would just add one other little nuance to that, David, and that is we have tended for I'm not sure how many generations to use the phrase melting pot, to imply that the immigrant comes here, leaves completely behind what was there, and now becomes American, of course without addressing the question that Rebecca asked, what does it mean to be American, whereas perhaps that's not quite the right image. It may be more like a tapestry. America is a tapestry, and you bring the colors that you bring from where you've come, and they become interwoven into the American tapestry, which is vibrant, because those colors remain interwoven and yet distinct. And that's subtle and that's tricky, but that's different from just leaving it all behind.
Yeah, but that is an individual response to the changing of my arena.
Right.
So maybe not everybody is able to do that. So it's, you know, that's why what we had this in your talk, you know, somebody went back to Germany because he couldn't hack it.
Yes, please. Thanks all, it was wonderful. This is actually directed to Stephen Rash. First of all, congratulations on using my favorite word, historicity. But most everybody else talked about the effect of migration and being pulled from your culture on the way you produce art. But I'd like to ask you, what is the effect on the way you view art once you've been displaced? Because you're really talking about the observational aspect.
Well, thanks for asking the question. Absolutely, it changes. You know, these in these two images that I used today, these are images, cultural anchors of their communities that they've had and taken for granted for all of their lives. And then people came in and tried to kill them overnight, wipe out their towns, wipe out everything that was dear to them, including their churches, including their history, and including everything that made them culturally who they were. So then when you have these pieces of art, sacred art in this case, that have survived that, they take on an entirely different meaning. It's not that the meaning that they had before, the religious, the sacred element of it is somehow lessened, but now it has that additional layer on top of it, a very important one, of survivability and of identity. You know, I spoke about this real discussion within the community about whether or not they should repair this artwork that has been damaged, or is now that violence that's occurred to the artwork now part of it because it's part of their identity. We lived through that. This painting, this icon lived through that. And so it's all of a piece, but they take on enormously greater importance. Just one other similar example of that, in that same village, when the priests came in, and we were taking the pictures, I was taking the pictures, ISIS had taken a statue of the Madonna, the Virgin Mary, off of its pedestal where it had been for 70, 80 years, and they had placed it right in front of the demolished altar and decapitated it and cut off the hands, and thrown the head in one direction and the hands in another direction, and just left the headless, handless body there. So when the priest came in and recovered it, and we recovered all the pieces, we put them all together. Well, some years later, let's see, it would have been 6 years later, that repaired statue of the Virgin Mary sat on the next to the altar of the dais for the Mass of Pope Francis when he came to Erbil in Iraq, and he blessed it. And now you can imagine the meaning that statue of the Virgin Mary has taken on. So it's not that what it had before was less, it's not that initial meaning had less, but absolutely these things become anchors now in a very different and deeper way, and the people appreciate them. You can't help but appreciate what has been taken away from you.
And isn't that the sort of question that in this little town was being asked for quite a long time with respect to what to do with the site of the Twin Towers and what kind of memorial to create to structures that many people didn't like before, that then became iconic once they were gone. So it has a very local as well as a universal kind of resonance, that sort of issue. It's a great question and a great answer.
Yes, please.
Following a little bit, taking your question way beyond that in a way, I was just curious to know if you could talk a little bit about how art made by immigrants can help other immigrants respond to immigration. You know, I mean, I'm thinking now about what's happening a little bit in Ukraine and just anywhere where immigrants are, and how the art that's made by those that came before can help them assimilate or deal with their own trauma of immigration. That's to anybody.
I'm not sure how, except for maybe becoming political oneself and go out and support immigration from, let's say, from Ukraine, I wouldn't think how an image can by itself, you know, take on the charge to be a helpful hand to anybody who wants to immigrate. So, I mean, when Stephen just spoke about the new meaning this icon or this Madonna got, I would say it's more like a charge. You know, it has been charged with a certain energy it didn't have before, and which is added to that meaning which it had before. But I can't really see how you could go consciously out there and make images or make art which kind of encourages other immigrants.
Although, you know, art has
not a political.
Well, art can have a very therapeutic
That is true.
consequence. The making of art, creating in the aftermath of destruction, and one sees that particularly with children who have been traumatized by this kind of experience. And you know, one of the things that Picasso once said about artists is that they haven't lost the capacity to be children with respect to how they engage reality. We become adult and we forget what that was like. And so with children that works, but I think with adults it can work as well, the act of making it. So someone who is skilled at making art in a context with those, that's not their métier, but they can draw something from it, perhaps, not all of them, and be inspired to feel revitalized by the very act of creating.
I wasn't thinking so much about art, but other people making art and responding to art made by their...
But I would argue the same thing. You take people through the museum, as particularly kids, right? So what does that work of art mean to you? I look at a David Stern, The Gathering. What is that? What's going on there? But that doesn't have to be limited to children, right? So I would think even presenting art to anybody, but someone who's been traumatized might offer just another avenue for self-exploration, self-expression, maybe healing.
I also want to add that, I mean, for example, with Paul Ben-Chaim, this doesn't really specifically answer your question, but artists, musicians moving from one place to another and find fellow artists and musicians, and then they're speaking the same language and they're fellow artists or musicians or any other kind of art. And so then they have a smaller community within, you know, their particular artists within an immigrant community. And so they, I would imagine that there are influences and shared ideas, and that can work as a genesis for creativity as well.
Yeah, I think I want to connect to that. I think as we have done in this online exhibition, which I encourage you all to discover and spend some time with, we saw the individual responses to the dislocation, to dealing with, as David said, the baggage of the old, of the home country and the cultural influences, and adding the new home and the influences, cultural influences of the new home to that, and to really look at these personal stories, look at the art that comes out of these personal experiences, which of course all are different, I think is very important to make people think about the experience and develop some empathy. And I think that is especially important right now. And I think all our participants, Ori Scholtes, Rebecca Erbilding, Stephen Rasche, David Stern, and Caroline Enger for being here and discussing with us this very, very rich topic, and for the stimulating conversation we had. I think especially here in America, as you said, Rebecca, we have to realize that we all have a personal immigration history, and it is important to remember the challenges that we or our ancestors had to face as strangers who had left their homeland forever and who came here as strangers, and that we really have the responsibility, because of that past history, that we help today's newcomers with openness, with solidarity and empathy. Thank you, everybody.